Jonathan Alter, you, of course, wrote a biography, a definitive biography of President Carter, published a few years ago. But this morning, share with us, if you will, a few of your top lines, a few of your biggest thoughts about President Carter, someone who so acclaimed in his post-presidency, and you argue, underrated while in office.
Well, Jonathan, President Carter led what can only be called an epic American life. He was born, as we know, 100 years ago, in 1924, but it might as well have been the 19th century, even earlier. No indoor plumbing, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. So in some senses, he was actually the only person you could think of who effectively lived in 3 centuries, the 19th century, the 20th century, of course, where he was involved with all of the great movements of that century, not to mention being president. And then the 21st, where he's been on the cutting edge, and the Carter Center has been central in the challenges of global health, conflict resolution, democracy promotion, the big issues of our century. And so I think it's important to look at him beyond this easy shorthand that you see everywhere. You know, mediocre president, great former president. Actually, that cliche is only half true. He was an inspirational former president who redefined that role, as Joe Biden said yesterday. But he was a much better president than people recognize. He's not going to go on Mount Rushmore, but he was in many ways a visionary American president who put a lot of points on the board for the environment, with his domestic legislation and other areas, and internationally, even beyond Camp David, the Panama Canal treaties, his human rights policy, normalization of relations with China, even bringing the hostages home safely. The foreign policy record of Jimmy Carter is much undervalued, and I think there's a long overdue appraisal underway of his presidency.
So, John Meacham, let's turn to you now. How should we be thinking, in your estimation, about Jimmy Carter today, a son of the South, a man of devout faith, who had his presidency and post-presidency, triumph and failure, so defined by the world stage?
Well, I think I agree with my friend John Alter. And the way I think about President Carter is he's a complicated man and driven by, like all people in the public arena, driven by different elements of ambition and service. And when you look at most American presidents, most of our key leaders in the arena, you have this tension. And what's so fascinating to me about President Carter is here he is, an evangelical Christian, a New Testament Christian, who had a fascination with Reinhold Niebuhr, who is the Protestant theologian who wrote books with titles like The Tragedy of American History. And so you have someone who believed in the capacity of human nature to make our lives, the lives of the less fortunate, better, stronger, even nobler. But you also have someone who recognized the limitations of human endeavor. And the epigraph of his great campaign book, Why Not the Best, in 1975-76, was from Niebuhr. And the quotation was, it's the sad duty of politics to establish justice in a sinful world. It's not exactly a bumper sticker, but there's a great truth to that. And so what I think we are examining, what we're going to experience this week, is something that often happens in American life, which is great public commemorations, great public contemplations, often tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the person being contemplated and commemorated. And what you're seeing, I think, with the passing of Jimmy Carter is a sad but illuminating sad but illuminating instance of someone who, while imperfect, believed in the centrality of character, the centrality of an abiding creed, at a moment in American politics where character is not at the forefront of most voters' minds.
So, Richard Haass, with that in mind, let's dive into President Carter's foreign policy record. Yes, highlighted in many ways by the hostages, highlighted by the Camp David Accords, but also set against the backdrop of the Cold War, a time so tense where there was a moment when his national security advisor, Mr. Brzezinski, thought that the nuclear end to the globe was coming, that it was just moments away. Talk to us about that particular time in American life.
Jonathan, let me just full disclosure. I was at the Pentagon during the Carter presidency, the last nearly 2 years of it. And what we saw at that time with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as well as the revolution in Iran, there was a real sense of upheaval. And the optimism about how history was going was interrupted. People forget towards the end of his term, Jimmy Carter dramatically increased defense spending. He put down the foundations of what became the American military capacity to intervene in the Persian Gulf and Middle East. In taking a step back, what was so interesting to me, and I actually agree with Jonathan Alter, I do think he was underestimated on his foreign policy, in part because of the Iran hostage crisis, which in many ways was his political undoing, perhaps along with inflation. But what was so interesting to me about Jimmy Carter is he embodied the two great traditions of American foreign policy. He was at one and the same time an idealist, brokering peace in the Middle East. It was, shall we say, a long shot at the time. His views about human rights in the Soviet Union. At the same time, he was a realist. The normalization of relations with communist China, recognizing them, de-recognizing Taiwan, the nuclear arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, the Panama Canal treaties, highly controversial. But from his point of view, this was the realistic way to go if we wanted to make sure that there wouldn't be violence on the scene and the United States and others could continue to use the canal. So that to me is what is so interesting. Most other presidents have struggled with getting that balance right. And again, I think as time passes, he will be seen as a successful one-term president in foreign policy. Interestingly enough, not unlike the subject of someone else I worked for and John Meacham wrote about, George Herbert Walker Bush, another largely successful foreign policy president who's seen better with the passage of time. And I think it raises the interesting question of how whether that might also be Joe Biden's fate.
Jonathan Alter, Simone Sanders Townsend here. You know, President Carter, he had a strong civil rights legacy. It's not known to many, and I'm sure you are very familiar, but he was the senior Dr. King. Dr. King's father was a close confidant of his. Dr. King's father advised him on many things. Civil rights is a key part of his legacy, and so is Ronald Reagan. Talk to us a little bit about the legacy that President Carter left and how in the end of his presidency, Reaganism was ushered in, and now that transformation to what we now know as MAGA in the current iteration of this Republican Party.
So just on the civil rights question, the journey that Jimmy Carter was on from growing up in the brutal Jim Crow South to becoming a president of the United States who took the government from tokenism to genuine diversity. And he appointed more black judges than any of his predecessors, all of them combined. Same thing with women. He appointed more women to the bench than all of his predecessors combined times 5. But it was a bumpy journey. And I remember when I was interviewing him, one of my many interviews with him for the book, at one point he stopped me and he said, you know, I never claimed to be part of the civil rights movement. So he never knew Martin Luther King, even though he was serving in the state Senate in Atlanta, but he represented a very conservative district in Georgia, and so he actually tacked right, not to the racist right, but he tacked right early in his career. And then when he became governor of Georgia, within seconds of taking the oath of office, he said the time for racial discrimination is over. And this was a shocking statement in Georgia politics. It put him on the map nationally in 1971. And there was a walkout of his white colleagues. And from then on, he basically spent the second half of his life making up for what he did not do in the first half, i.e. stand up for civil rights. And he put Dr. King's portrait in the Georgia State Capitol and became very close to Daddy King, Coretta King, and went on to this career that we're familiar with in civil rights. And as far as Reagan goes, the idea of Make America Great Again, MAGA, that notion actually started with Ronald Reagan. So he was using some of these same nationalist arguments, including against the Panama Canal, that we now can see in the Trump movement. There is a connective tissue between Reagan and Trump, although Reagan had some character. And so we were living in a time when, even though politics was rough, there were these guardrails that existed in the Carter-Reagan period. And these are now back at issue, and we're asking questions about decency in our politics that are raised by the life and career of Jimmy Carter, who was a man of peace and great decency.